Hello, and welcome to Digital Marketing Musings. I'm Gaia.
And I'm Andrea.
Today we're sitting down with Melissa Riley to talk about digital marketing trends identified in Merkle's Digital Marketing Report during Q4 of 2020. Melissa is an Associate Director of Performance Media and Marketing Communications here at Merkle. She's been in performance marketing for over 11 years, managing paid search accounts at Merkle, primarily in the retail vertical. And with that, Melissa, welcome to our show.
Thanks for having me.
To kick us off, for new listeners, what is the Digital Marketing Report?
So the Digital Marketing Report is something we've been putting out each quarter for a number of years now. It's a publication that highlights online performance trends for Merkle clients from the previous quarter. So in our current version, we look at a few different channels. We look at paid search, organic search, Amazon ads, and then display and paid social. And for our data set, we make sure to only look at clients that have been with Merkle for at least the last 15 months, just to make sure we got good year-over-year data to look at and analyze. And then we eliminate any major anomalies or outliers too. So, for example, if a client makes a big change in strategy one quarter and it's not really reflective of what's happening in the broader industry, we'll exclude them from the report.
Sounds like a really comprehensive data set.
Yeah, definitely.
What trends did we see in Q4 for paid search?
So for paid search, we saw some of our year-over-year growth trends look really similar to growth trends in Q1. So just to remind everyone, 2020 was a bit of a wild ride. In Q2, yeah, I'm sure everyone's well aware. Can't forget that quite yet. But in Q2, we saw astronomical growth in clicks year over year and a decline in CPCs for paid search. In Q3, we started to see those differences kind of lessened, but they were still much greater than what we typically see. And then by Q4, CPC and click growth were kind of back in the range of what we saw for a lot of 2019. So we did see some interesting device level trends. On Google, we saw that desktop share increased a lot in the November-December timeframe. We actually saw a similar thing happen back in March and April when lockdowns were first implemented, which made a lot of sense. We know that people are more likely to use desktop when they're spending more time at home. So I think what we saw in Q4 when desktop usage increased was from folks either traveling less for the holidays or staying home as COVID cases increased a lot post-Thanksgiving. Or honestly, it was probably a combination of both. But as we saw that desktop usage increase, we also saw some changes in text and shopping formats. So we saw text spending increase 20% year over year, which is the strongest it's been for at least 2 years. Meanwhile, shopping growth was just 2% year over year, which is the lowest it's been in a really long time. So the shift in desktop traffic really benefited text ads more. We saw that in the device growth trend by format when we looked at click and CPC growth for each. And it's hard to say what the underlying factor was for that trend. A lot of people or a lot of retailers had inventory constraints this year with the increase in demand throughout Q2, Q3, and Q4. So that likely played a part with those retailers having fewer products to advertise in shopping. Some more of that holiday search volume could have shifted towards text. And then a final key trend that we saw for paid search was just some inclination from customers that they were willing to go back to stores. So we have a couple of traffic-focused metrics that we look at, or store traffic-focused, like LIAs, store visits, and get location details. And all those showed some rebounds in Q4. So not quite to pre-pandemic levels yet, but customers showing some willingness to get back into stores.
Yeah, I'd imagine just naturally during Q4, a lot of people are typically in the mode of going back into stores and shopping and doing holiday shopping or returns after holiday or clearance sales at the end of the quarter. So I would definitely have expected to see some of that rebound.
Yeah, and I think it's important to note that this doesn't necessarily mean that people were going physically into stores and browsing around like they would have in the past. A lot of retailers kind of revamped their curbside pickup options and like buy online, pickup in store. So it could be that more people were just using those features during the holiday too.
Yeah, I know for organic side of things, we have seen quite a bit of people looking for like store hours and that sort of thing as well. So I wonder if that could be impacted by it also.
Yeah, definitely.
And speaking of organic, do you want to get into some of the trends that we saw in the DMR for that?
Sure. So organic search continued to see really great strength this quarter. Visits were up 31% year over year for Q4, and we've seen similar figures for Q2 and Q3 as well. A lot of that growth was from retail, not surprisingly. And it's interesting if we look at it on a month by month basis, organic growth was weakest for retail when it was strongest for paid search and vice versa, which we kind of like to see that because it shows the complementary nature of the two programs. It makes sense that if a retailer is pulling back in paid search, that there might be more organic search floating to the top. So
That's a really interesting insight. This is like the first time I've heard that observation.
yeah, at first it was a little odd to see. I think November for organic search was down or up the least year over year. And at first glance, that was surprising, just because November had Cyber Monday this year. We saw a lot of like pulled forward demand in November from December. But then when looking at it in conjunction with paid search trends, it made a little bit more sense.
Yeah, at least from anecdotal evidence, it seems like a lot of retailers, while we continue to give the message of holidays starting earlier this year, even starting towards the tail end of October, or even beginning of October with Prime Day getting pushed back, and that they should be pushing budgets forward ahead of Cyber Week this year. It still seems like a lot of retailers invested really heavily during the key Cyber Week this year.
Yeah, absolutely. Um,
Cool.
and then also in organic, just from a device standpoint, um, we did see a decrease here in mobile traffic, though it wasn't quite as drastic as what we saw in paid search. Share dropped from being 64% in Q3 down to just 62% in Q4. And that mobile traffic actually performed really well year over year. Click-through rate was up 9%, while desktop was down 5%. So not exactly the same as what we saw in paid search, but mobile share was still down a little bit from the previous quarter.
Cool. And then I know Amazon ads are something that we're tracking as well. What new observations did you have for that?
Yeah, so looking first at sponsored products, which is the vast majority of Amazon search ad spend for our clients, we saw 55% spend growth year over year and 57% sales growth. This is kind of similar to what we saw with paid search. CPC growth reversed trend from how it had been looking earlier in the year and was actually positive for the first time in 2020 in Q4. So just from probably increased competition during the holiday season. But then looking at sponsored brands, which is the next biggest segment, we saw growth there as well. It wasn't quite as strong, 48% year over year in sales and 40% in spend year over year. For this format, throughout 2020, Amazon released a few different new ad placements, so less of the spend was concentrated for sponsored brands in the traditional like top of search results page. So for anyone that's not familiar, historically, sponsored brands, if you perform a search on Amazon, those ad units would largely show up at the very top of the results. So, and it would look like a banner with like 3 different products potentially to choose from. But now they've expanded out the placement options for that format, so it's not just showing up in that really prominent spot, it's showing up elsewhere too. And one interesting call out for sponsored brands, they were really strong in October, up over 200% year over year. That was just from heavy investment during Prime Day. As you mentioned earlier, Prime Day was in October this year after typically being in July. So it was interesting to see that year over year change. Um, and similar to what we saw in paid search for both sponsored brands and sponsored products, December was the weakest in terms of year over year growth.
Cool. And rounding us out across channels, what about display and paid social? Any cool things from there?
So in paid social, the election was a big part of the storyline. Political campaigns invest pretty heavily across paid social, and with advertisers fighting for the same inventory, we typically see it drive up CPM. And we did see that play out on both Facebook and Instagram, where CPM increased 10% and 14% year over year, respectively, for Q4. And looking more at Instagram, we did see that it got about 20% of total Facebook spend in Q4, which is lower than what it was in Q3. There is an option on Facebook called the placement optimization tool, which advertisers are starting to opt into, and it allows machine learning to pick which placements to spend on across each of the platforms. So takes some of that control out of the hands of the advertiser. So as long as more advertisers continue to opt into that, I'd expect that we'd see Instagram's percent of total Facebook spend fluctuate as the machine learning algorithms kind of make those decisions for advertisers.
Got it.
So, are there any like specific trends by industry that you found surprising, or were we able to dive into that level of detail?
Yeah, so we did look at trends by industry for paid and organic search. Pretty much across the board, we saw that travel started to claw its way back a little bit. So there were still year over year declines in both organic and paid search, but the declines were a lot less dramatic than what we saw earlier in the year. I think the vaccine distribution having started is making people a little bit more hopeful about taking trips in 2021. So we started to see a little bit of renewed interest in at least researching travel again. Um, can't really tell from the data whether people are actually booking vacations, but they're at least thinking about it.
I know for myself personally, I've definitely been like, "Ooh, where can I go next?" Despite still kind of being locked down, but definitely on my mind of like, where can I go?
Yes, me too. Um, And then in retail, we continued to see a lot of strength year over year, which wasn't surprising. Within our organic search client set, especially, we have a good number of essential goods retailers, and they continue to perform really strongly year over year. But retail as a whole did get a nice boost from the holiday season. So, yeah, and especially in November for paid search, I think I mentioned this earlier, but Cyber Monday back in 2019 fell in December, and then in 2020 it shifted earlier and fell in November. So year over year comps for that month were really good.
Are there any trends that you might have not mentioned already that either surprised you or ones that you have predictions on going into Q1 of 2021?
I was surprised that Prime Day didn't appear to have as big an impact on paid search in October. There was a lot of hype ahead of time that Prime Day being in October was going to get the holiday season started early, and we didn't necessarily see that in the data. In hindsight, I think a big part of it was the kind of the unique climate that we saw in retail in 2020. So, as I was mentioning, there was a surge in a lot of e-commerce demand throughout the year. So some retailers weren't as interested in running really strong promotions alongside Prime Day because they were confident that they could sell through inventory without offering a big discount. So I think that was a big part of why Prime Day didn't jump off the page from paid search. And then the device shifts that we saw in paid search were also surprising to me. Makes a lot of sense looking back on it, but I don't think I was expecting the behavior in the November, December timeframe to look so similar to what we saw when there were lockdowns across much of the country.
A lot of people quarantining after the huge COVID spikes around Thanksgiving,
Yeah,
for sure.
exactly.
Yeah. Yeah. So, last question for you. What predictions do you have for Q1 of 2021?
Well, after 2020, the idea of trying to predict the future is a little unsettling, but but I
Very
think
true.
I think we will see a few things. I think paid search will stay on the path it's currently on with growth figures kind of comparable to what we saw in Q4 and what we had seen before the pandemic. I think that shopping growth will bounce back too, with retailers less stressed from an inventory perspective. And I think we'll continue to see the willingness to go to stores. I think we'll keep seeing that improve with the vaccine rollout continuing. Um, on the organic side, I think we'll see visit growth decrease after having been elevated for a few quarters. Though with the number of essential retailers that we have within our client set, I think that really heavily depends on how COVID numbers trend over the next few months. So we'll have to see how that goes. But and then on paid social, I think we'll continue to see some diversification away from Facebook and Instagram. I don't think I mentioned this earlier, but uh, there were a few smaller paid social channels like Pinterest, Snapchat, and Twitter that all had double-digit spend share in Q4. I think we'll continue to see that trend just with people wanting to diversify their programs a little bit and not rely so heavily on the Facebook ecosystem. So, and then TikTok, I think, will potentially become more prominent too from an ad spend share. That will be interesting to see in Q1 how that shakes out.
Yeah, we just had an episode talking about the trends that we saw around the Super Bowl, and that was definitely one of the biggest takeaways was how brands are leaning into TikTok just to get way more scale for lower or comparable CPMs than they've had on some other paid social channels.
You read my mind, Gaia. I was going to call that out too.
Great. Well, Melissa, thank you so much for your time today. We really hope that you'll come back and talk to us in the future about future DMRs.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
Absolutely. And with that, thank you to our listeners. This has been Digital Marketing Musings.